Gorilla Team. I don't know if you've ever read some of these books like Mr. Slow and Mr. Noisy, but they're really silly. Let's start with Mr. Noisy. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading a story to you, he'd be shouting it at the top of his voice, and the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place. Indeed, you can hear it 100 miles away. Look, he's reading his own book. See, that's his book he's reading. For example, when most people sneeze, shoo, you can hear them in the next room. But when Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. That's really far. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in his bedroom in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds like more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Ding, 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 ding. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounded like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounded more like a fire engine. And Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of the hill where Mr. Noisy lives. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house and he shut the door behind him. Slam, bang, bang. The door wobbled and the house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbled, Wobbleton wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. That's how hard he slammed that door. Then came Mr. Noisy walking up the hill, clump, 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 and he walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumble trembled, but she sold him the loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, said Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him the meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy. Absolutely, he said. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say, asked Mr. Crumb. He pretended that he didn't hear him. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I'd like a loaf of bread, said Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up, and he went out. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's butcher shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended he didn't hear him. I'd like a piece of meat, said Mr. Noisy. Did you say something, said Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat. Pardon? Mr. Noisy gave up, and he went out, and he went home, and he went to bed, and he was hungry because he didn't get all the things he needed. The next day, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice, a loaf of... And then he stopped and thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
"I'd like a piece of meat," he said.
Did you say something?" said Mr. Bacon.
"Yes, I did," shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. "I said I'd like a—"
And then he stopped, and he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please," said Mr. Noisy. Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped and thought, and then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before, and you know what? It was fun. Mr. Noisy arrived at his door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped and he thought, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before, and that was fun, too. Do you know something? From then on, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbleton are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know what else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. I really enjoyed reading that story with you guys, Yeladim.